Ladies and gentlemen, in a world overflowing with voices, notifications, and unending chatter, we often confuse noise with life. But have you ever wondered what might happen if, just for a moment, the noise stopped? Imagine standing by a still lake at dawn. No voices, no machines, no distractions, just you, your thoughts, and the quiet presence of God. That is where true transformation begins. Silence is often mistaken as absence, but in reality, it is presence. The presence of something deeper, something sacred. It is in silence that we hear the whispers of eternity, the gentle nudges of conscience, and the quiet call of God. Solitude is not about loneliness. Loneliness is the ache of being unwanted. Solitude is the gift of being with yourself and with God. In solitude, the masks fall away, the noise of the world fades, and the soul finally breathes. It is here we learn to be still and to know. Our noisy world thrives on distraction, pulling us from one urgency to another, leaving us restless. But when we choose silence and solitude, even for a few moments each day, we create space for peace. We allow the eternal to enter the ordinary. Silence is not emptiness, it is fullness. The world around us has convinced us that noise equals life. If there is no sound, we assume something is wrong. We fill our homes with background music, our cars with the radio, our minds with endless chatter. We are trained to think that silence is a void, an absence, a vacuum that must be filled. But in truth, silence is overflowing with presence. It is in silence that we learn to listen beneath the noise of our lives, to discover the whispers that cannot compete with the shouts of the world. The psalmist once declared, "Be still and know that I am God." Notice the order: first stillness, then knowing. Knowledge of God does not come in the storm of words, but in the stillness where we stop striving. One wise teacher once said that silence is the language of God. Everything else is a poor translation. The deeper we go into silence, the more we hear, not less. We begin to hear the pulse of creation, the rhythm of our own breath, the quiet nudging of the spirit that is always present but seldom recognized. I remember meeting an old man who had lived much of his life in the mountains. He told me that when he first left the city, the silence frightened him. At night, he would toss and turn because there were no horns, no engines, no endless voices. But after some weeks, he began to notice other sounds. He heard the wind curling through the pine trees, the faint crackle of a fire, even the beating of his own heart. Then he said with a smile, "In that silence, I began to hear God's laughter." His story reminds us that silence is not about hearing nothing. It is about hearing what truly matters. We often treat silence as a punishment. Think of how we discipline children: go sit in the corner and be quiet. We associate quietness with guilt or shame. Yet silence is not a prison, it is a doorway into freedom. When we embrace it, silence no longer feels like exile, but like homecoming. It teaches us to rest from the compulsion to speak, from the endless need to defend ourselves, explain ourselves, or prove ourselves. In silence, we no longer need to manage our image. We simply are. There is a story told of a monk who took a vow of silence. A curious visitor asked him, "Why do you not speak?" The monk replied, "When I speak, I cannot hear. When I am silent, everything speaks." The visitor thought it foolish, but as he spent the day in the monastery, he noticed the birdsong, the sound of the river outside, the gentle movement of robes as the monks walked in prayer. And in that silence, the visitor began to hear his own soul. That is the power of silence. It reveals what is always there but buried beneath the avalanche of noise. Silence also has a way of purifying us. Words, as good as they are, often become weapons. We use them to wound, to boast, to manipulate, to impress. But when we choose silence, we lay down our weapons. We learn restraint. We realize we do not always need to answer, defend, or argue. Sometimes the most powerful statement is not spoken. Proverbs tells us, "Even a fool is thought wise if he keeps silent." How many times have we wished we had said less, not more? Silence teaches humility, and humility is fertile soil for divine wisdom. But silence alone is not enough. Silence must be wed with solitude. Solitude is not the same as being alone. You can be alone in a crowded room if your heart feels isolated, and you can experience solitude even while surrounded by others if your spirit is centered and still. Solitude is not loneliness. Loneliness is the feeling of emptiness when we crave human company. Solitude is the fullness of being when we recognize the presence of God as more than enough. One of the greatest gifts solitude gives is the opportunity to face ourselves. We are masters of distraction. We scroll through devices, run from one activity to another, fill our schedules so full that we never have to ask the hard questions, who am I? What am I afraid of? Where is my soul headed? Solitude takes away our hiding places. It lays us bare. It feels uncomfortable at first because the masks we wear begin to crack. But in that stripping away, a truer self emerges. The self that is not defined by applause, not shaped by comparisons, not driven by performance. The self that simply rests in being a child of God. There is an old tale of a young man who sought wisdom from a desert hermit. He asked the hermit, "Why do you live out here away from the city, away from people?" The hermit replied, "Because in the city I could not see clearly. The dust of voices clouded my sight. Here in solitude I see the stars." The young man pressed further, "But do you not miss the company of others?" The hermit said, "When I am with God, I am never without company." That simple story reveals the paradox of solitude. When we withdraw from people for a time, we discover a deeper communion that sustains us when we return. Solitude is not escapism, it is preparation. The goal is not to flee from the world, but to return to it with a heart that has been renewed. Jesus himself sought solitude, withdrawing to the mountains or the desert, but he always came back to serve, to teach, to heal. Solitude fills the well so we can draw water for others. Without it, we run dry. With it, we overflow. In solitude, we also learn to listen differently. When you are constantly surrounded by others, their voices shape you. Their expectations mold you. Their judgments weigh on you. But when you step away into solitude, those voices fade and another voice rises. The voice that says, "You are my beloved." This voice is gentle, steady, unwavering. It is not concerned with your resume or your reputation. It simply calls you home. There is a story of a composer who, after writing many symphonies, stopped writing for several years. When asked why, he said, "I had lost the sound of silence. Without it, I could no longer hear music." That story speaks to us all. Without solitude, we lose the sound of silence. And without silence, our lives lose harmony. We become like instruments out of tune, playing too loudly but never beautifully. Another gift of solitude is freedom from the tyranny of approval. Most of us, if we are honest, live under the shadow of what others think. We measure ourselves by applause or criticism. But solitude teaches us that we do not live for the eyes of many, but for the gaze of one. When we learn to be content in God's presence alone, we become free. Free from the need to perform, free from the need to impress. And that freedom spills into our relationships, making them healthier and truer. Let me tell you about a woman who used to walk every morning in the fields near her village. Her neighbors thought it odd because she always went alone. One day a child asked her, "Why do you walk alone every day?" She bent down, smiled, and whispered, "Because I am not alone. I walk with the one who loves me." That woman had discovered solitude not as isolation, but as companionship. Her life radiated peace, and people were drawn to her not because she sought attention, but because her solitude had made her whole. Silence and solitude are not luxuries. They are necessities for the soul. Just as the body cannot survive without rest, the spirit cannot thrive without stillness. And yet, we treat them as optional, as if they are rewards for the few who can afford them. But they are for all of us. We can begin with just a few minutes each day, turning off the noise, setting aside the screens, sitting quietly in the presence of God. Over time, those minutes grow into a habit, and the habit becomes a way of life. The world will not make this easy. It thrives on distraction. It profits from your noise. But the invitation is always there. Come away and rest a while. When we accept, we discover that silence is not empty, it is full. And solitude is not loneliness, it is communion. These are not disciplines that drain us, but gifts that restore us. They lead us back to the core of who we are and to the God who has been waiting in the quiet all along. Silence and solitude are not ends in themselves. They are pathways, gateways into something greater. When embraced with intention, they open the way to deeper connection with God. We are not chasing silence as a novelty or solitude as a personal escape. We are creating space, clearing the clutter, so the divine presence can fill what the world has crowded out. Without silence and solitude, prayer becomes shallow, worship becomes hurried, and our faith can feel like performance. With them, prayer deepens, worship breathes, and faith grows roots that storms cannot tear out. Think for a moment about how many voices compete for your attention in a single day. The news reports shouting for urgency. Advertisements promising happiness if only you buy. Social media feeding you endless comparisons. Even the voices inside your head, self-doubt, fear, worry. In the midst of such noise, how do you discern the voice of God? The answer is found in silence and solitude. They strip away the competition. They make space for listening. The prophet Elijah discovered this on Mount Horeb. He expected God in the earthquake, in the wind, in the fire, but God was not there. Then came the gentle whisper, That is the voice of God, quiet, persistent, tender. And only a soul accustomed to silence can hear it. There was once a young pastor who complained to an older mentor that he could not hear God speak. The mentor asked him, "Do you ever sit in silence?" The young man said, "I pray often." The mentor pressed, "Yes, but do you stop talking long enough to listen?" The young man was puzzled. Prayer, for him, had always meant words, requests, praises. But the mentor smiled and said, "Prayer is not a monologue. It is a conversation, and conversations require listening." That truth unlocked something. In the weeks that followed, the young man began to sit each morning, not to talk, but to listen. And slowly, the still small voice became clear. We tend to fill our prayers with so many words because silence feels awkward. Yet it is often in those awkward moments, when nothing is said, that something profound is spoken in our hearts. The deepest communion with God is not in endless petitions, but in shared presence. Like two dear friends sitting together by a fire, no words are needed because love fills the silence. When we allow ourselves that kind of quiet in prayer, we begin to notice God speaking in ways we had overlooked, through scripture, through creation, through the stirring of our own spirit. One writer once described it this way: silence is God's first language, everything else is a poor translation. The more we cultivate silence, the more fluent we become in that language. We stop treating God like a vending machine for blessings and start treating him as a father, a friend, a companion. Silence becomes the sacred meeting place where our souls align with his heart. Now, this connection with God is not meant to pull us away from life, but to ground us in it. A tree with deep roots can withstand storms. A soul with deep silence can withstand chaos. Our world is filled with restlessness, anxiety, and hurry, but silence and solitude anchor us. They give us stability when everything else shakes. They give us clarity when decisions overwhelm us. They give us courage when fear threatens to undo us. There is a story about a sailor caught in a fierce storm at sea. The winds raged, the waves threatened to swallow the ship. Others panicked, but the sailor remained calm. When asked why, he said, "I have an anchor." That is what silence and solitude do for the soul. They anchor us in God. The storm may not cease, but the soul does not drift. And this leads us to the fourth truth: a noisy world cannot give peace, but silence and solitude can anchor us in spiritual stillness. Many chase peace through entertainment, possessions, achievements, but the peace they find is temporary. It evaporates the moment circumstances change. True peace cannot be bought, earned, or engineered. It is received, and it is received in the still places, in the quiet where God whispers, "Peace I give to you, not as the world gives." Peace is not the absence of problems, but the presence of God in the midst of them. This presence becomes tangible in silence. Consider the example of a mother holding her child. The child may cry, may struggle, may feel restless, but the moment the mother pulls the child close and rocks gently in silence, a calmness spreads. Nothing outward has changed. The noise of life still surrounds, but the presence of love brings peace. In the same way, when we enter silence and solitude, we are held by God. Circumstances may not shift, but our hearts do. A businessman once confessed that he lived with constant anxiety. Every day was a rush of meetings, phone calls, deadlines. One evening, while walking home, he decided to sit quietly on a park bench for 10 minutes before entering his house. No phone, no agenda, just silence. At first, his mind raced, listing everything he still had to do. But then he noticed the rustle of leaves, the fading light of the sunset, the sound of children laughing in the distance. His breath slowed. Peace seeped in. He began making that practice a daily rhythm, and in time his family noticed he came home calmer, kinder, more present. Silence had given him an anchor. The world will never stop being noisy. In fact, the noise will grow. But silence and solitude offer a resistance. They say to the noise, "You do not own me." They say to the hurry, "You cannot define me." They say to the anxiety, "You will not rule me." In silence, the soul remembers who it is. In solitude, the heart remembers whose it is. That memory creates peace nothing external can touch. There is an old proverb that says, "Within you there is a stillness and a sanctuary to which you can retreat at any time and be yourself." That sanctuary is not found in external escapes, but in inner stillness. Silence and solitude train us to enter that sanctuary, to dwell there, and to carry its peace back into the noise of daily life. A farmer once explained his secret to patience during a drought. He said, "The roots go down deep. When the rains are scarce, the roots still find water." In the same way, when we cultivate silence and solitude, our roots sink deep into the presence of God. The droughts of life may come, sickness, disappointment, uncertainty, but the soul still finds living water. That is the difference between peace as the world gives and peace as God gives. The world's peace evaporates in crisis. God's peace deepens in crisis. And so silence and solitude are not optional luxuries for saints and mystics. They are the lifeline for every soul that longs for God, for every heart weary of noise, for every life that craves peace. They invite us to step aside from the endless clamor and to hear the one voice that matters. They remind us that stillness is not weakness but strength, not emptiness but fullness. And they teach us that while the world may be noisy, our hearts can be anchored, steady, at rest in God. So let us dare to step away from the chaos. Let us turn off the noise, close the door, and seek the stillness where God is waiting. For in silence and solitude, we do not lose ourselves. We finally find ourselves. Thank you.